Hi, welcome to my first ever video lecture. I'm sorry we couldn't meet today. It was supposed to be our last day together and we were going to cover chapter 15. I was going to finish that for the Tuesday, Thursday group, and we were going to cover it in our 2-hour class today for the Wednesday afternoon evening class. I hope you're all staying dry. I know I am. I decided to do a video lecture to give you some final pointers on what to know for the final exam. I have posted the study guide onto iLearn. I've also posted the chapter 16 lecture slides onto iLearn, and I emailed you a link to a Federal Reserve video that I was going to show in class today. I highly recommend that you watch that. It will help you prepare for the final exam. I also really encourage you to draw the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model on paper. You're going to have to do that several times on the final exam. So please practice drawing the graphs. It's not a good idea for the first time to be when you sit down to take the exam next Thursday. So I would recommend practicing several times, drawing the graphs, shifting the curves, and also email me with any questions that you have on the study guide. I will probably be in Tuesday. I don't have office hours on Tuesday normally, but I'm thinking that I will come in Tuesday and hold some office hours. I don't have anybody else in the office on Tuesdays, and some of you will be in final exams, but please come on by. I will be in my office from 12:30 to 3:30 on Tuesday. I was not able to get a room for a study session. They really frowned on reserving a room at this time of the year. But please either email me or come on by with questions about the final exam. I really look forward to hearing from you. I will post the solutions Monday morning, but over the weekend, I'd really like for you to look at the book, look at your lecture notes, look at the PowerPoint presentations, and try and come up with the answers to the problems on the study guide on your own before you actually read through the solutions that I post Monday morning. Okay, so let's get going. Chapter 15 was all about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Chapter 15 really focuses on how in the long run the economy moves back to full employment output all on its own. So each point along the aggregate demand curve is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, C being household consumption expenditures, investment being primarily gross business investment in things like structures, tools, computers, software, machinery, office buildings, factories, but also included in investment are inventory investment and new homes. Government spending, whether it's for paper clips or trucks or bridges or airports, any type of expenditure is included in government spending. And net exports is, of course, exports minus imports. So there are 4 reasons that we discussed that the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. And those 4 reasons are the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, the foreign exchange effect, and the foreign relative price effect. We have discussed those. That should be reviewed. We discussed them when we covered chapter 15. You can look into chapter 15 PowerPoint presentation, and there's one that for each that discusses each of those effects. The textbook only talks about the exchange rate effect, but the relative price effect is another reason that net exports change when the price level changes within a country. Also remember, there are several things that are held constant along the aggregate demand curve, and there is a slide in the chapter 15 lecture slides that summarizes them. It's good to know what's held constant along the aggregate demand curve, because on the exam you're going to have to know what will shift the aggregate demand curve. And if you understand that list of everything that we hold constant along the aggregate demand curve, you'll know what causes it to shift, because if one of those variables changes, that leads to a shift in the aggregate demand curve, which will change the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium real GDP level. Now, also on this graph, this is all review, but review is good. Also on this graph is the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, the amount of GDP is determined by the amount of capital we have, the amount of natural resources we have, the amount of labor that we have, our level of technology, and also our level of human capital. So if any of those change, and they do change over time, you'll have a shift in the long run aggregate supply curve. So long run economic growth, this isn't the best model for illustrating long run economic growth, but if we were to illustrate long run economic growth, we would show the long run aggregate supply curve shifting further and further to the right. It is vertical because price does not affect long run aggregate supply. It is determined by this physical input-output structure of the economy. Again, capital, labor, human capital, natural resources, and the level of technology. When that changes, the long run aggregate supply curve shifts. And it's also important to know that as the long run aggregate supply curve shifts, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts with it. The long run aggregate supply curve, as we discussed, can shift left in case of war. Destruction of capital and human life will shift the curve left. Natural disasters, such as the one that we're going through now, San Francisco State University and many other schools, roads being shut down, that is our physical capital being shut down and not accessible, and so economic activity will be reduced as a result of this storm. Of course, we'll snap back when the storm is over, unlike in case of war or much larger natural disasters. Now, we do have deviations from the natural level of output. So here at the natural level of output, remember, we never have 0% unemployment rate. The unemployment rate when we are at natural rate of output, which is the full employment output level, the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. We do have deviations from that natural rate of unemployment and from the full employment output. What causes the changes in the business cycle? We have recessions, we have booms, and then we'll have recessions. Luckily, the expansionary periods of the economy are much longer than the recessions, but market capitalist economies are subject to the business cycle. And so even though in the long run we have this natural rate of output, in the short run we do deviate from that full employment output. What causes that? Supply shocks and demand shocks. So what is a demand shock? A demand shock will occur, let's say a crash in the stock market that makes people feel poor. Why do they feel poor? Well, because they are poor. Their nominal wealth has fallen in a crash in the stock market. So they feel poor and consumption then will fall. And so a fall in the stock market will cause a left shift in aggregate demand. Now, of course, that's not the only thing that will cause a left shift in the aggregate demand curve. A fall in government spending will cause that. If Congress were to increase taxes, increase the income tax, that would leave us with less after-tax income. That would lead to a fall in consumption also, and a left shift in the aggregate demand curve. We've talked about the dot-com bust that occurred after year 2000. So leading up to year 2000, companies were investing in a lot of information technology equipment. Year 2000 came and went. They didn't need to engage in that much investment anymore, and so we had the dot-com bust when investment fell. So falling investment either because year 2000 came and went, or maybe businesses become more pessimistic about possible market conditions. They might drop their investment levels. When government spending falls, that will cause a left shift in the aggregate demand curve. So as Congress works to lower government spending to close the budget deficit, all else remaining equal, that would cause a left shift in the aggregate demand curve. Also, if our trading partners undergo a recession, they will buy fewer of our exports. As exports fall, that will cause a fall in aggregate demand and a left shift in the aggregate demand curve. So all of these result in a fall in equilibrium GDP, and all else remaining equal, a fall in the price level. Now, at this lower level of GDP, unemployment is rising. Incomes are falling, employment is falling, and unemployment is rising. And so when we are in a condition where output is below the natural rate of output, eventually the workers will receive a lower wage. Unemployment is high, employees can be easily replaced, the price level has fallen, and eventually price expectations are more in line with the lower price level. Employees all throughout the economy accept lower wages, and the lower wages lower business costs, and that causes an increase in short-run aggregate supply. So again, this is a review of chapter 15, but review is good. It is the falling wages caused by the high level of unemployment that the drop in aggregate demand caused that increases short-run aggregate supply and brings us back to full employment, albeit at lower wages. Now, it's only the short-run aggregate supply curve that shifts under these conditions because it's changes in prices that are occurring. And prices do not affect the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's why we draw it vertical to the price level axis. Now, what chapter 16 is about is government managing the economy back to full employment. So in this case, with government very active in managing the economy, we don't wait for the long run to come about. Under normal circumstances, the long run can last 1 to 2 years, which means 1 to 2 years of low levels of employment, high levels of unemployment, low levels of income, and a lot of human suffering. The 1946 Full Employment Act charged Congress with maintaining full employment in the economy. And also early in the 20th century, when the Federal Reserve was created, they were given the dual mandate of full employment and price stability. So both the Federal Reserve and Congress are charged with maintaining full employment. So we don't wait for this long-run adjustment to occur in the economy. Government does intervene. They are required by law to intervene. So what would happen instead of the long-run adjustments? Let me get my eraser. So in the case of falling output, that would lead to unemployment exceeding the natural rate of unemployment and also lower price level. So the Federal Reserve would step in and they would buy bonds. So they would buy bonds from bond traders and they would wire transfer new deposits into the banking system. That immediately increases the money supply. Increase in the money supply will lead to lower interest rates, and lower interest rates will lead to higher investment spending. Now, ideally, if the Federal Reserve were able to fine-tune the economy exactly how they would like, they would increase the money supply and lower the interest rate, and spending would increase, and we would snap back to the natural rate of unemployment. In reality, that kind of fine-tuning is very difficult, but this is the policy goal. The policy goal is to increase the money supply, reduce interest rates, and increase spending so that aggregate demand is restored to its full employment level. Now, it's not only the Federal Reserve that can manage the economy. For example, as we've talked about in class, in 2001, we were in the middle of the recession, and Congress lowered income taxes. When our income taxes are lowered, we have higher after-tax income that increases consumer spending, and consumer spending, being part of the aggregate demand equation, will increase. And so the lower taxes increased aggregate demand. So in the recession, aggregate demand fell. And the lower taxes, at the same time the Federal Reserve did also increase the money supply and lower the interest rates. That then increases aggregate demand back to ideally where it was before. And that did happen in the 2001 recession because the policy was so well timed. It was one of the briefest recessions ever, and full employment was restored very quickly. In this last recession, for some reason, recessions that are caused by financial crises take much longer to recover from. So the Federal Reserve has been very, very aggressive, keeping interest rates near 0%. And yet we're just now, the recovery started in June of 2009, and we're just now getting back to full employment. Although we did have what's called fiscal drag occurring throughout this time period. So the Federal Reserve really had to fight fiscal drag. So we had aggregate demand fall. And in February of 2009, Congress passed the Reinvestment and Recovery Act that did increase government spending. When government spending increases, that is a direct increase in aggregate demand. So we did have an increase in aggregate demand. Due to an increase in government spending. But over time, as the recovery started, a lot of congressional representatives were more concerned about the budget deficit. And so we had what's called fiscal drag. We had government spending falling even before full employment had been restored. So the Federal Reserve was really doing all the work of government managing the economy. The Federal Reserve was increasing the money supply phenomenally at the same time that government spending was falling and dragging down aggregate demand, slowing the recovery. So a lot of economists were arguing that we shouldn't be balancing the budget at a time when we were below full employment. We should wait until the economy was restored to full employment before we cut government spending. And so during this period of 2011, 2012, as the federal government spending was falling aggressively, the Federal Reserve was really doing all the work of keeping the economy afloat by increasing the money supply and keeping interest rates low so that investment spending and consumer spending on big ticket items continued to grow. So I think I'll take a moment to define monetary policy. We did this on Tuesday for those of us that meet 2 days a week, but for those of you in the Thursday 335 class, we have not actually defined monetary and fiscal policy officially together. So monetary policy are actions taken by the Central Monetary Authority to influence the size of the money supply and interest rates in order to maintain price stability and full employment. So again, monetary policy is actions taken by the Central Monetary Authority to influence the size of the money supply and interest rates in the economy to manage aggregate demand in order to maintain price stability and full employment. Fiscal policy is conducted by the central government. In the United States, it's conducted by Congress. Fiscal policy is central government actions to change the levels of taxation and government spending to influence aggregate demand in order to maintain full employment. So again, fiscal policy is central government actions to change the level of taxation and government spending in the economy to influence aggregate demand and maintain full employment. So in a recession, let me just summarize this here. So in a recession, the Congress or a central government in another country can impact aggregate demand directly by increasing its own spending. Let's say by building a new airport. They'll put out a request for bids on construction of a new airport, and the funds will be allocated to the project, the funds will be spent, and that's directly increasing spending in the economy. So increase in government spending is one fiscal policy that can help get an economy out of recession when there has been a negative demand shock that's reduced spending. Other ways that Congress can get an economy out of recession is by decreasing taxes. So decreasing income taxes leads to increased after-tax income, which leads to higher consumption. Also, there can be so sometimes the government will give businesses tax credits for either investment or research and development, and this makes research and development and investment in capital goods cheaper, and when the price of these things are lowered, businesses, all else remaining equal, will increase the amount of investment or R&D that they do, and that increases spending in the economy and will help shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So some of the tax incentives are lower taxes for householders that increase consumer spending, and sometimes businesses are given tax credits to encourage business investment spending as well. So, so there are these two types of fiscal policy that can help the economy recover from a recession by managing aggregate demand, by increasing aggregate demand, shifting the AD curve to the right to help restore full employment. Now, for monetary policy, in which the Federal Reserve has been very aggressively pursuing, monetary policy does affect aggregate demand in the short run, and the Fed will increase the money supply, and that leads to lower interest rates. Which leads to higher investment. The interest rate is really important for businesses considering buying equipment, building a new office building, building a new factory. These very large ticket items tend to be financed with loans. And when the cost of the loans declines, the cost of the investment declines, and so therefore investment will increase, all else remaining equal. So how does the Federal Reserve actually go about lowering interest rates to increase aggregate demand to end a recession? Well, we can illustrate this by using the money demand and supply graph. On the vertical axis, the y-axis is interest rate, that's the price of money, and on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of money. The demand for money is a downward sloping demand curve. At lower interest rates, we're willing to hold more money. Money is very liquid. We can use it immediately for transactions. It's very convenient. So we like holding money either as cash in our pockets or money in our checking accounts that we can spend quickly. However, the opportunity cost of holding money is the interest rate. So as interest rates rise, we're willing to give up the convenience of liquidity in exchange for interest income. So as I've mentioned before, there are many ways that we can earn income over the course of our lives. Most of us will earn the majority of our income from offering our labor services on the labor market. But we can also earn income other ways: rental income, dividend income, and one source is interest income. So when interest rates rise, we will give up the convenience of liquidity in order to earn that interest income. So that's what's behind the downward slope to the money demand curve. In our theory, we assume that the Federal Reserve has perfect control over the money supply and it's not dependent on the interest rate. So we draw it as a vertical line. And so money supply is determined by the Federal Reserve. It's not a function of the interest rate, it's a function of monetary policy. And when you combine money demand and money supply, you come up with an equilibrium interest rate. Now, in a recession where aggregate demand has fallen, say investment has fallen, that leads to a fall in GDP below the natural rate of output. Unemployment is rising, income is rising, and all else remaining equal, the price level would fall. So this is not acceptable to the Federal Reserve, who has that dual mandate of price stability and full employment. So what they will do under these conditions is increase the money supply in order to lower the interest rate. So we can illustrate the effect of an increase in the money supply on the interest rate in this graph. So this would be money supply 2, the increase money in the economy lowers the interest rate. And as the interest rate falls, investment in capital goods, building new buildings, buying expensive pieces of machinery, it becomes cheaper. And so lower interest rates will raise investment spending. Okay? And investment being part of the aggregate demand equation, C plus I plus G plus NX, aggregate demand will then rise in response to the higher level of the money supply, which drives down the interest rate. Now this is a monetary policy response to a fall in aggregate demand that causes a recession. Let's take a look at the policy responses to a boom. Now on the exam, you don't have to put numbers, you can just put P1. I like to put numbers on the axes so that I'm better able to illustrate the effect on the price level when there are shifts in either the short-run aggregate supply curve or the aggregate demand curve. And so here we start out in long-run equilibrium. And this is Y natural, the natural rate of output, full employment output. And remember that the long-run aggregate supply curve, where its position depends upon capital, labor, natural resources, level of technology, and level of human capital. So in the short run, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward. We do have deviations in output from the natural level, the full employment level of GDP. And remember from chapter 15 that the reason that the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward is due to the sticky wages. So workers agree to a certain level of wages and salaries, the boom comes about and employment rises, the price level rises, but wages are sticky. They're not adjusted instantaneously. Usually wages are adjusted every 1 to 3 years. And so in the short run, there's an increase in employment, increase in output, but workers eventually find that their purchasing power has fallen as we move along this curve, say due to increase in aggregate demand because of increased investment in housing. So all else remaining equal, the investment in housing would drive the price level up. Because of a boom in investment, the building of new homes is included in that investment category of aggregate demand of GDP. So in the short run, businesses will increase output, aggregate demand has risen, their input prices have not, and so profits have risen. So employment increases, output increases, GDP increases, and unemployment falls. So at Y2, the unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment. We've got a really, really tight labor market. So before we look at policy, let's take a look at what would happen in the long run. And why is policy needed? Well, in this case, incomes are rising, unemployment is falling. What's the problem? Well, the problem here is that the price level, if this were over the course of a year, that's 10% inflation. So when the price level rises from 100 to 110, that is a 10% rate of inflation. The Federal Reserve considers price stability 1 to 2% inflation. So this is well over acceptable level of price increases. And the Federal Reserve is required to maintain price stability in the economy. So this is not okay. This scenario is not okay for the Federal Reserve. So they will need to react. But let's say that the Federal Reserve was not going to step in, that we were going to let the economy adjust on its own in the long run. So Chapter 15 discusses long-run adjustments in the economy. Here, the input prices, especially wages, are held fixed along the short-run aggregate supply curve, as are price expectations. But after a while, the wage earners and salary earners go out shopping, and they realize that their fixed wages do not buy as many goods and services. So once they realize that their purchasing power has fallen because the price level has risen, they raise their price expectations to equal the actual price level. They go to their bosses, and this is all throughout the economy. Unemployment is very low. The price level has risen all throughout the economy. Workers are experiencing fall in purchasing power, fall in real wages. And because of the tight labor market, because at Y2, the actual unemployment rate is lower than the natural unemployment rate, we've got a really tight labor market. If you were to quit your job, your employer would have a really difficult time replacing you. So in a market such as this, in a labor market such as this, when you realize your purchasing power has fallen, you will negotiate and you will receive a raise. And again, this isn't just happening for you, this is a macro effect. And so workers all throughout the economy are getting raises as their price expectations rise to, once again, equal the actual price level. The increase in wages then increases business costs all throughout the economy, and that causes a reduction in short-run aggregate supply. So the natural rate of output is restored, albeit at a higher price level. Now again, this is not okay for the Federal Reserve. They are charged with price stability, and what's happening here is what's called a wage price spiral. We have a boom, prices rise, wages rise, prices rise further, and the Federal Reserve doesn't want this to occur. They want to nip this in the bud before inflationary expectations get entrenched in the economy, before contracts start incorporating these higher rates of inflation. So this long-run adjustment ideally does not occur. Since the Federal Reserve is charged with price stability when they see a boom like this, what they will do is they will reduce the money supply, and that increases interest rates. So the Federal Reserve again reduces the money supply, increases interest rates, and that causes investment spending to fall, ideally back to the initial level. Now this kind of fine-tuning in real life doesn't happen perfectly like this, but this would be the policy goal. The policy goal for the Federal Reserve is really just to rain on our parade and reduce aggregate demand. Why? To restore price stability, to avoid that wage price spiral that causes so many distortions in the economy that we talked about in chapter 12 when we looked at inflation. So the Federal Reserve can reduce the money supply, increase interest rates, and cause aggregate demand to fall. And that restores us back to full employment output and back to our original price level. Theoretically, we can also have fiscal policy step in. So theoretically, fiscal policy can move us back to full employment output and price stability. And I say theoretically because the Congress is not charged with price stability. They are charged with full employment. So the Full Employment Act of 1946 did make it the government's responsibility to maintain full employment. Well, most elected officials would actually really like this because unemployment is really low and income and output is growing. But theoretically, if they wanted to maintain stability in the economy, fiscal policy can slow the economy as well. Well, how can they do that? By directly cutting aggregate demand by reducing government spending. So remember, again, the aggregate demand curve, every point along the aggregate demand curve is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. And if we reduce government spending, then we might snap back to the original aggregate demand curve. And so I've labeled it aggregate demand curve 1 and 3. And so that would be C plus I plus lower G plus NX. Okay, that would lead us to a lower level of aggregate demand that would restore us to price stability and full employment output. In reality, once government programs are put into place, they're very hard to cancel. People benefiting from the programs really like them. They don't like them to be shut down. And generally, Congress doesn't like to intervene in the business cycle this way. They tend to lose votes when they purposely try to slow the economy. Now, another way that they could do it is to raise taxes, and that is definitely a career breaker. So aggregate demand curve 3 could occur not through lower government spending, but by higher taxes that reduces consumer spending. So to slow the economy, Congress could increase income taxes. That decreases the amount of after-tax income that we have, and that reduces consumption, which reduces aggregate demand. But again, it tends not to happen. Congress tends not to manage the economy in that way because it's very unpopular and they probably wouldn't get voted back into their job at the next election. So usually slowing the economy in this manner is left to the Federal Reserve because they are charged with price stability and they're politically independent. Now, an exception has been that the Congress has been cutting government spending. And all else remaining equal, what cutting government spending does is it reduces aggregate demand So the fall in aggregate demand occurs because we have this very large budget deficit, and Congress wants to close that budget deficit. And the fall in government spending, they have been doing that until this latest offensive in Syria. Federal government spending was falling steadily, quarter after quarter, and we were calling that fiscal drag. So again, this was fiscal drag. Stimulating the economy was left entirely to the Federal Reserve during this time, and many argued that we shouldn't be balancing the budget at a time when unemployment was high. We should wait until full employment was restored and then work towards closing the budget deficit. But many in Congress believed that the large budget deficit was creating business uncertainty and holding down business investment. So their thinking was, you close the budget deficit, then business confidence is restored and investment will rise and aggregate demand will rise. So that was the belief behind the fall in government spending at a time when we were trying to recover from a recession. So let's take a look at what the Federal Reserve does when they rein in a boom. So we'll put the boom back on here. So there's been a dramatic rise in the stock market this year, and that has fueled consumer spending, increased consumption, and all else remaining equal, that will cause an increase in the price level and the economy to exceed natural rate of output. And the Federal Reserve then would increase interest rates to reduce investment spending and bring us back to price stability. Well, how does that work? How does it work when the Federal Reserve reduces the money supply? Let's take a look again at the money market. So if the Federal Reserve wants to cool the economy, they would reduce the money supply. So R being the symbol for the interest rate. And the reduction in the money supply causes investment to fall, and that causes aggregate demand to fall, and that cools the economy, brings it back to full employment level of output. Now, what does it mean? I mean, how exactly does the Federal Reserve reduce the money supply? Well, the way it works, and we've discussed this before, is we have the Fed over here, and they have a portfolio where they have bond holdings. And then we have banks over here. And then we have transactions going on between the bond sellers and buyers and the Federal Reserve. So in the case of increasing interest rates, what happens is the Federal Reserve reduces its holdings of bonds. It sells bonds let's say $100 billion in bonds are sold, and then the bond trader must pay the Federal Reserve for that. And if you remember, the money supply is cash and currency in circulation in the public, and also balances in checking accounts. So when the bond traders buys the bonds from the Fed, they now have 100 billion more bonds that they can sell their customers, but they have 100 billion less in cash in their banking account, and then that money then is destroyed, thus reducing the money supply, and the reduction in the money supply drives up interest rates. So just to summarize the portion of Chapter 16 that is being covered on the exam, it is monetary and fiscal policy response to changes in the economy and how to bring the economy back to full employment output, that level of output, YN, where the unemployment rate equals the natural rate of unemployment. So we've got fiscal policy, where the Congress, in the case of the United States, would be the central government. In other countries, they can change taxes. So lower taxes leads to increased aggregate demand. If it's lower income taxes, it leads to increased consumption. If it's tax credits for business, it can lead to increased investment. And the opposite is true when taxes are raised or when tax credits are eliminated. It would reduce aggregate demand. But another direct impact of fiscal policy is to increase or decrease So again, taxation and spending policy make up fiscal policy, and it impacts aggregate demand. Now, in the case of monetary policy, increasing the money supply leads to a lower interest rate, which increases investment spending, spending on capital equipment, inventories, or buildings, things like new homes, new machinery, new computers, software, new office buildings, new factories. And to cool the economy, a decrease in the money supply leads to an increase in the interest rate, which leads to a decrease in investment, which will slow the economy down and restore price stability. So one of the last things that I want to cover is just to show how, with a supply shock, what a difficult job the Federal Reserve has. So again, P is not price, it's price level. Aggregate demand curve slopes downward because of the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, the foreign exchange rate effect, and also the relative foreign price effect. Okay. Short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward because in the short run, sometimes the price level and price expectations are not equal. And for that reason, we've got those three theories that you can look up in your textbook or the PowerPoint presentations for why this difference in the actual price level from price expectations causes movements along the short run aggregate supply curve. And we've got our long run output level. Not affected by prices, affected by real variables such as the level of capital, amount of labor, amount of natural resources, technology, and the level of human capital. So oftentimes we experience supply shocks, such as in the spring of 2008, we had a very dramatic increase in oil prices, food prices as well. It was the first time gasoline prices in the United States ever got over $4 a gallon. Caused a terrible run-up in the price level and energy prices. Since energy is used by all businesses, that does cause a reduction in aggregate supply when it's an increase in oil prices. And so that caused an increase in the price level and a reduction in output and also a rise in unemployment. So this is a condition of stagflation. Stagflation is when we have both rising prices and rising unemployment at the same time. Now, the policy response to stagflation is very difficult for the Federal Reserve because of their dual mandate. They are charged with full employment and price stability. They have neither here. They have rising unemployment at the same time prices are rising. Again, that's stagflation. Stagflation is defined as either rising unemployment and rising inflation, or rising inflation as output is falling. We've got a recession, and yet prices are rising because of this supply shock of higher oil and food prices throughout the economy. Food prices were rising in the spring of 2008 as well due to the United States energy policy of diverting corn from the food supply to the energy supply because Congress passed a law mandating an increased content of ethanol in our gasoline supply. So again, food prices started to rise. Corn is traded globally, and prices rose for corn globally because the United States was diverting large amounts of corn from the food supply to the energy supply, and also there were floods and droughts in other parts of the world that were reducing corn output. So we had this supply shock that raised the price level, and all else remaining equal would increase the unemployment rate. So the policy response to this would be the Federal Reserve would have to choose price stability or full employment. It couldn't do both. Okay, so again, the Federal Reserve would have to choose between price stability or full employment. And let's see why they can't do both. So let's say that the Federal Reserve decided to restore full employment. They would do that by increasing the money supply so that interest rates would be lowered to stimulate investment spending, and that would increase aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand were to increase because of Federal Reserve policy, yes, full employment output would be restored, but the price level would be raised even higher. And so the Federal Reserve would be violating their price stability mandate. So let's say instead that they decided to pursue price stability, the decrease in the money supply would raise the interest rate and cause aggregate demand to fall. So we would end up back to price stability, but the recession would deepen further. So in a situation with stagflation, it causes a lot of suffering. It's really difficult to have the appropriate policy response. But in 2008, the Federal Reserve didn't have to grapple with this issue, because what ended up happening as the year moved along is that the United States recession spread into a global recession after the freezing of the financial markets. And so we had aggregate demand fall. Oil prices fell as output and income were falling throughout the world. Demand for energy fell, so therefore demand for oil fell, so therefore oil prices fell. And so oil prices fell quite dramatically, and so that would have increased aggregate supply. But aggregate demand was falling at the same time, and so it was falling much more dramatically than this. In the spring of 2009, aggregate demand was falling because investment was falling, because loans were very difficult to get, and consumption was falling because the stock market fell 40%. So aggregate demand fell quite dramatically in the United States in that time period. And we did end up having the first drop in the price level since the Great Depression. So I'm going to go ahead and end this lecture here. I hope that reviewing the shifting of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves helps you understand the material more fully for the exam next week. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions about the study guide that I've posted on iLearn. One thing that's not on the study guide that you do need to know are the 4 reasons for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve, and also stagflation. Well, I put a solution to the in-class problem to the solutions to the study guide. They're not up yet, but when I post the solutions to the study guide Monday morning, you'll have a little sheet that covers stagflation. Stagflation will be on the exam, and you will be asked to explain why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, and also why the aggregate supply curve in the short run slopes upward. So review the study guides and ask me questions via email. Do come by Tuesday if you are on campus in between exams, or if you can come in an extra day. I will be in my office, as I mentioned, from 12:30 to 3:30. I'd be really happy to go over the study guide and answer your questions then. I encourage you to actually do the problems on the study guide. It's a way that you will retain the knowledge much better. Sort of tough it out, and then Monday morning take a look at the answers, see if that's what you got. If not, read the solutions to the problems, and then I encourage printing out the study guide again and attempting the problems on your own again. That is the best way to retain the information for the exam on Thursday. Also, practice drawing the graph, because you are going to have to draw the graph several times in the exam on Thursday. Okay, so any questions, email me, or I will see you on Tuesday. Thank you so much, and I hope you're staying dry today.